You guys are a chatty bunch this morning. Go ahead and grab a seat. Hey, I don't know if any of you remember this, but, back in 1988, Paula Abdul made an incredible statement, an observation about culture. She says that it ain't fiction, it's a natural fact that we come together because opposites attract. You guys remember that video? You guys remember Paula Abdul dancing with DJ Scat Cat? Anybody remember that? Did I just totally date myself? Anybody? In 1988, I was asking Christine in the back about the slides, and I was like, "You remember when were you born?" And she was like, "It was like she was -7 when that came out." I'm like, "Oh my gosh, I'm old." I'm that guy. Like earlier this week, I saw something. I got to share this. It has nothing to do with the sermon, but I got an email that somehow I'm subscribed to, and it had this awesome stuff about love and about marriage. It was around Valentine's Day. And I was like, this is so good. And I started forwarding it to people. And then I was like, oh my gosh, I am my dad. I am forwarding emails. Just like, oh my, wow. Okay, that had nothing to do with anything, but except that I'm old, and I was making a Paula Abdul reference because I was thinking this week just about how different Katie and I are. Katie is my wife. We've been married almost 17 years, and we are super, super different. If we were standing up here today, you would know it right away. And some of you know because my wife is tall and I am short. And so we look, we are fulfilling, Paula's prophecy. The opposites do attract. And maybe you're in a marriage like that. Maybe you're in a dating relationship like that. We come together, and especially when we tie the knot, all those differences that, were just mysterious and fun when we were dating, now all of a sudden, you just get on our nerves. You know what I'm talking about? I know you don't want to laugh right now, but it's true. It's like, these things become more prominent. All of a sudden you learn things you never knew before. Maybe because, in the starry-eyed romance of things, you were just willing to sweep some things under the rug, that's not that bad. Or perhaps some things just sort of never came out. And now all of a sudden, in marriage, these things are exposed. And it's not just our differences and our wirings. It's everything else. It's our past relationships and our experiences in those. It's our family of origins. It's our relationships with our moms and our dads or whoever may have raised us and what happened in those relationships. We bring all of that. We bring our hearts. We bring our struggles. We bring our hurts. We bring our expectations. And it's kind of like, we bring all this baggage and we bring it into our relationship. And eventually, at some point, that stuff comes out. Let me see if I can illustrate this for us. I want to introduce you this morning to Mr. and Mrs. Mugg. Mr. and Mrs. Mugg have an incredible story. They met in college, like so many young couples do, and he was cute, and she was, well, look at her. Look at the handles. And, they just were quickly falling in love, he was getting a degree. He was going places. He's smart and funny, and she liked everything that he liked, or at least pretended to, right? And, they start dating, and, they're being really careful with one another in their dating relationship. You may know how this goes, and they're just, he's trying to win her heart, and she's trying to win his affection, and they're putting their best foot forward, and they have a few issues along the way, but nothing really big, so they tie the knot, and they get married, and then about a month in, they hit a bump. And stuff comes out. And all of a sudden, they're like, where did that come from? What's all that stuff? She's like, whoa, how did I not see how angry you could become? And he's like, what in the world is all of that? Like, how do we... What are we going to do? And then they try to figure that out, and then, it's bumpy again, and more stuff comes out, and then she goes to talk to her mom, and she's like, I did not know that he was going to be, and he goes and he talks to whoever guys go and talk to, about their feelings. He's in the garage. He's mowing the grass again for the second time today. And he's thinking, she makes me so mad. When she does that or when she says that, I'd be like, she bumps into me and it just, she just, and she's thinking, how could he be so, and why, where is all this coming from? I never had seen that before. And both of them are kind of thinking, if we just didn't bump into one another, then this stuff wouldn't come out. He's absolutely convinced that if she would stop saying that thing or doing that thing or, being a little bit more this or that, and not bumping into him, that stuff wouldn't come out of him. And she's convinced that if he would just, be a little more or say a little less or do this or start that or stop that and be a little more careful, then that, stuff wouldn't come out. But here's the reality. The blue beads are coming out of Mr. Mugg because that's what's in there. And these pink beads are coming out of Mrs. Mugg. Why? You guys are good. Because that's what's in there. And it's so easy to blame the other person, especially in a relationship as close as marriage is, when we see the good, the bad, and especially the ugly. To think that it's that person's fault, when in reality, the reason that stuff comes out is because that stuff is in there. And we all have stuff in us, and that stuff that is in us is going to come out of us at some point. So what do we do about it? What do we do with this stuff that is in us? Well, in the Old Testament book of Proverbs, the author there, one of perhaps the wisest man to ever live, King Solomon, spoke into this. And in fact, Jesus would speak into this later on in the New Testament, in the Gospels, and he would say it a little bit different way. But listen to what King Solomon says in Proverbs 4:23. He says, above all else, and when we read that, we could just stop and pause for a second, because when the wisest man to live, when he says above all else, what he's saying is, pay attention. What I'm about to say is important. In fact, it might be more important than anything else I've ever said before. And that's saying a lot, because Solomon writes about all kinds of things just in the book of Proverbs alone. He talks about in relationships and sex in Song of Solomon. He's talking about life and work and the meaning of all things in Ecclesiastes. In Proverbs, he's talking about everything from what we look at to what we say to the relationships we build, how we conduct our business, wisdom for life. I mean, he's covered it all. And he says right here, above all else, here it is, guard your heart. In other words, the most important thing you can do is to pay attention to what's going on in there. That Hebrew concept for heart. I mean, we see the word heart when we read it in our English Bibles, but it was this incredibly rich, deep concept of sort of the seat or the core of our emotions, our values, our morals, our will. It's the core of everything. And Solomon is saying, you got to guard that thing. You got to keep the bad guys out. You got to let the good in. You've got to protect what's valuable. But even that feels like an abstract concept. Guard your heart. What does that really mean? Well, perhaps understanding a little bit about that word guard will help us. It comes from a root word that we see hundreds of times in the Old Testament, shamar. It can mean guard, watch over. It can also mean keep. In Psalm 121, the psalm that I read just a few moments ago, perhaps you notice the repetition of that word keep, keep, keep. It's this word shamar. It's where we get this idea of guarding and watching over. The Lord will keep you. The Lord will guard you and watch over you and pay attention to you and what you need. We use this word to describe what our oldest daughter does these days. She's a teenager now, and one of the perks of having a teenage daughter as the oldest, it means we've got some built-in babysitting. It's awesome. And we say sometimes, Annie, we need you to keep the girls on Saturday night because your mom and dad are going out on a date. If I had a nickel for every time I said that, I'd have a quarter, But anyway, it's good in theory, right? We don't expect her, when she keeps the girls, to just stand guard at the door and not let anyone, in or out. It's way more than that. When Annie keeps the littles, she's got to listen to their needs. She has to watch over them with care. She provides for them, and she helps them, and she pays attention to them, or at least that's what we think is happening while we're out, right? And ignorance is bliss. We're just going to let it go, But that's what we think is happening. At least that's in our minds. That's the idea of keeping. And Solomon is saying, above all else, I want you to do that for your heart. Why? Look how he finishes. Because everything you do flows from it. Everything you do flows from this place. That means everything about your relationship, everything about your marriage, every word you say, every action, every response, every thought, it's all coming from here. And this is a challenging thing. It's challenging because we're not really good at this. Here's what we are good at. We are good at paying attention to, watching over, monitoring our spouse's behavior. We're pretty good at that. Watching what they're doing or not doing, saying, not saying. We understand how to do that. We're just not as good at paying attention to our own hearts. Which is why we have to be attentive. The reason that we have to be attentive is because, we want to feel a certain way. We got into this relationship because we wanted to feel cherished. We wanted to feel beautiful. We wanted to feel important and honored and valuable. And we were made to feel that way. And that's why we, the way he makes me feel. Oh, the way she makes me feel, the romance. I feel so great when I'm with him or with her, and they make me feel so special, and we love that, and that's what sucks us in like a tractor beam, And then we get married, and our spouses do things that don't make us feel that way. And we get frustrated. We're let down, and we're disappointed because we've come to rely upon, perhaps even depend upon, and maybe a little too much dependent upon their actions and how they make us feel. The reality is this is pretty natural. It's pretty normal. We want to feel these good things. We want to feel like the most beautiful girl in the world. We want to feel like a hero. And when we don't feel that way, stuff comes out. And then we blame the other person. And yet, that stuff's coming out because that stuff's in us. Yeah, the behavior of your spouse, it's a part of this. And we get that part. But what about this part? What about the stuff that's already in us, that's now coming out of us in spite of who's with us? We need to know something about the condition of our heart if we're going to pay attention to it and guard it. And the Bible is devastatingly clear on this subject. God speaks through the prophet Jeremiah again in the Old Testament, and he says this in Jeremiah 17:9. He says, "The heart is deceitful above all things and desperately sick. Who can understand it?" That's a pretty serious diagnosis. This is how God sees our heart. Desperately sick. Deceitful even. It's hard to trust it. It's hard to know it. It's hard to understand it. That's why we sometimes think, where did that come from? I don't know. I don't know what that is. The Bible says that the reason that we are in this predicament, the reason that we have a heart that is desperately sick is because of sin. It's brokenness. We're marred and lost, prone to wonder, thinking we can go our own way and do it on our own and leave God behind, rebelling against His will. That's what our sin is. What it does is it kills our hearts. And there is nothing that can solve this problem. No set of rules that'll help us. There's no set of best practices or self-help books that are going to help cure this desperately sick heart. And God sees that, which is why He steps in and He says this. He makes this promise in Ezekiel 36. He says, I'm going to give you a new heart. And I'm going to give you a new spirit. And I'm going to take that heart of stone and I'm going to take it out of you. And then I'm going to replace it with a heart of flesh that is soft and malleable and able to relate to me and able to follow me and respond to me and live out the purpose that I designed for you. God knew the only way to save us was to give us a heart transplant, which is why He sent His Son Jesus into the world to live a perfect life and die a brutal death on a cross to pay the penalty for our sin so that we could have that new heart, so that we could have that Spirit that we invited in here a few moments ago, the Holy Spirit to come and dwell inside us and begin to change us in that heart. And now everything that will flow out of us will be infused with that Spirit and with the goodness of God and the grace of God. He's given us the power over our sin to live the way He's called us to live. That's the beauty of the gospel. That's why we celebrate. But we have to understand just how bad our condition really is. I read this week that someone said, if we have too small a view of our sin, our view of God's grace will be small too. We have to understand just how broken and fallen we are. How that not only impacts our eternity, our relationship with God, but how that impacts our marriage, our friendships, our parenting, the way we respond to everything we encounter in life. We're broken. But God can save. Jesus was talking to some guys that weren't getting it. They were not ready to believe that they needed help, that they needed a Savior, or that Jesus was the Savior. And this is what He said to them in Matthew 9. He said, it's not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. And then He said, I've not come to call the righteous, or those who think they are, but the sinners. See, here's the good news in that. While our condition is desperate and bleak, God does not look at us and shame us or condemn us. He makes a way for us through His Son Jesus. But we have to acknowledge that we need a doctor, that we need to be saved, that we need a heart transplant, that we need something to happen in here that will change and empower us to be the people He's called us to be. We need Jesus to give us the eternal security of our souls. We need Jesus to help us relate to one another well and to have healthy marriages and be great parents and be good friends and encounter the ups and the downs of life. So we have to understand the condition of our hearts. Everything you do comes from it. But it's more than just that. Because what's coming out of our hearts, and especially if you're a follower of Jesus with that new heart and that new spirit in you, yeah, you're going to mess up. You're still going to sin. You're still going to blow it, but you're not enslaved by it anymore. You can now live like he's called you to live, and you can be taught and grow, and your faith can bloom and blossom and bear fruit in these great ways. And then you can begin to pay attention to what's going on in your heart, and we have to do that. We have to listen to what our heart's trying to tell us, the voice of our heart. And the voice of our heart is our feelings. It's our emotions. They're trying to speak to us and reveal things to us. Guys, I don't want to lose you right here. I don't want you to be like, oh, great. We talk about our feelings. You know, guys are like, I have two feelings, happy and frustrated, you know, and just certain versions of those. Maybe a third feeling, but I'm not going to talk about it here because it's a family show, you know? And that's constant. Let that sink in for a second. Move on. We've been reading a book as a staff. It's called The Voice of the Heart. I actually have an extra copy of it. I left it on the front row right there. Anybody that would like a copy of this book, come up after the service, and the first one who gets to me, I'll give it to you. This is a fantastic book. It's called A Call to Full Living. I love that. And the whole premise of this book is that our hearts are trying to tell us something about what's going on inside here. You know, what we are feeling. And if we'll pay attention to that, we can really grow as people. We can really flourish and thrive as husbands and wives and friends and moms and dads and sons and daughters. It talks about these 8 core emotions and how each of them reveal something about our hearts that's actually really good, a longing for us. But we have to pay attention to what our hearts are trying to say. And I know that can be a little bit hard, but if we're going to disarm the conflict in our marriage before it explodes, or we're going to repair things after the volcano has already erupted and stuff has come out, we're going to need some help in that. We're going to need a process, you know, for monitoring what's going on there and guarding what's happening there. So I want to give you 3 steps this morning. Here's the first step. Stop and think. You've probably heard your mama say, you know, stop and think before you speak, you know. Think before you say something because it might be dumb or it might be hurtful, it might be wrong, and, you know, it just might get you into trouble. So stop and think before you speak. James chapter 1, verse 19, great verse for this. James says, brothers, let every person be quick to hear, slow to speak, and slow to anger. That's a great principle. But what I'm talking about here is stop and think, what am I feeling? What's going on in here right now? Because we just bumped up against each other and he just said something or she just did something and I'm feeling this, and you know what came out, it came from this thing that I'm feeling. And if we would stop and think about that, we begin to discover what's really going on. Stop and think, what am I feeling? Why am I reacting this way? Now, in order to do that, we need a vocabulary for what it is that we're feeling. And I know that, like I said, guys don't have as extensive of a vocabulary about their emotions and feelings as girls do. I know we were reading this book as a staff, and the guys are like, we're blown away. Like our minds are hurting as we think about feelings, you know, and we're underlining and highlighting everything. We're like, did you know? And the girls are like, why are we reading this? Like, it's just like so natural to them. They're like, yeah, I live this way every day, you know, and the guys are like, whoa. It doesn't mean that, you know, guys are less, you know, have less emotions than girls. We need some help kind of unearthing this and maybe giving us a vocabulary. And so that's what I want to do. I want to give you a vocabulary that might begin to help. And you might want to write some of these down, especially if some of these resonate with you, or if you've ever felt something like this, or perhaps something like this ever sort of elicited a response or caused a response to come out of you. Here are some conditions of the heart that come out of the back of that book I just described. Unimportant. You know, when you speak to me that way, it just makes me feel like you don't need me. And that's why I respond the way I do. Unlovable. Helpless. You know, when you talk to me about this thing and you share this problem with me and it just keeps coming up and I don't know what to do. And so the reason that sometimes, especially us guys, respond just sort of like, we sort of blow up is because guys, we hate to not know what to do. We hate feeling helpless. But to be able to identify that, it's powerful. Confused, alone, dumb. You know, when you talk to me like that, or, you know, you come around behind me and you fix everything that I was doing, you know, like, it makes me feel dumb. Betrayed, threatened. I feel threatened when you do that. Trapped, jealous. I think the real thing is I'm kind of envious that you're able to do that thing. And so I've been treating you poorly because of it. Scared, inadequate, disrespected. Chris talked about this last week. It's one of the core needs of a man to feel respected. And oftentimes we respond in anger to something and we don't really know why, but the deeper issue is that we're feeling disrespected. Insecure. Like a failure. We don't want to feel that way. But the reason we need to stop and think about what we're feeling is so that we can do step 2 is name it. To name it and say, I'm feeling this. I'm feeling disrespected. Sometimes it's hard to know what we're feeling. And sometimes it's hard to say out loud when we do know what we're feeling, because that's a vulnerable place to be, to share with someone, especially someone as close to you who's seen the good, the bad, and the ugly, to share just how you are feeling. How will they respond? Or maybe it's also hard to say out loud because then you can no longer use it to control the other person's behavior. And once you bring it out into the open, you sort of lost your power or your excuse. And that might feel scary, but it's actually freedom. That's why you have to name it. And then the third thing is you got to share it. First, you share it with God. He knows what's going on in your heart. He's the one who can speak into this stuff that's in there. He knows exactly how to heal it. He wants to do that. And oftentimes, when we begin to do the hard work of figuring out why we responded the way we did, or why we're thinking what we're thinking, or just what it is that we're feeling that's driving all of this, a lot of times it's not a her thing or a him thing. It's not her fault or his fault. It's not a marriage issue. It's a me issue. God's wanting to reveal something that's going on in here. Everything's kind of coming out of that place that's hurting, that place that's envious, that place that's insecure. So we share it with God, and then we share it with our spouse if we need to. And they may need to hear about this. They may need to know, because it may be something that they're doing that's causing those places to be poked and hurt and exposed. Last week, this got real in the Teague house. I was trying to apply the sermon, and last week was a great sermon. If you missed it, Chris talked about the needs of men, the needs of women, the roles that God has designed, and when we do that and they function in a healthy way, we have the best marriage because it was God's design from the very beginning. And so I went home and I'm like, hey, honey, what stood out for you in the sermon? And I was kind of hoping that she would say something, whatever. But then I could talk about my needs and how she was going to meet my needs. And I was like, so what stuck out to you? And she didn't have anything to say, and it was a little bit cold. And I was like, okay. And she's like, well, what stuck out to you? And I was like, well, actually, that part, where he was talking about like how you would be this and this, and, you're going to meet my needs. Like that really, and I was really trying to be pure-hearted about it. I was like, that really resonated with me. I was excited about that. And she just kind of rolled over. And in this particular case, stuff didn't come out. Stuff got stuffed. And in that moment, I was frustrated, right? That's our emotion, guys, frustrated. Because I didn't like the way she was making me feel. She was shutting me out. She wasn't responding. I'm trying to lead here, and she's giving me coldness. And there have been so many times in my marriage when I would have responded immediately in anger or frustration or just pout, try to, punish her. But because I've had to be thinking about this, I leaned in. I said, what's going on? You've been distant lately. You're not sharing with me. Something's going on. What are you feeling? And through the process of this conversation, she said, I feel alone. She's been working hard. I've been sick for 2 weeks. Kids have been busy. It's an incredibly busy season at church. She's been tonning it. And she feels alone. And guys, I got to be honest with you. And so many times I've responded. In fact, I was starting to respond this way. In my mind, I was preparing my argument because I was going to apply logic and all the reasons why she's wrong. You're not alone. I'm right here. I help, I put a dish in the dishwasher, like, you're not alone. But instead, like in a moment of God's grace and mercy, I said, thank you for telling me. I'm so sorry you feel that way. I don't want you to feel alone. How we respond to someone when they're willing to open up and share what's going on in there is huge. Proverbs says, a soft word turns away wrath. So many times I would have tried to tell her why what she's feeling isn't right, when the reality is it's what she's feeling. And I had to deal with what I was feeling and my frustration, and why was that? And it was just because I was being selfish. This is why it's so important, guys, that we begin to develop, we begin to practice, we begin to grow in this way of guarding our hearts, to pay attention to what's going on in here, because everything you do flows out of it. So we stop and we think. We name it, or we ask God to help us discover it. We share it with Him, and then we have a talk about it. We begin to grow as a couple, and to grow in our marriage as we grow in our understanding of our hearts and what's in there and what God's wanting to do in us.